Chapter 5, Section 2, Warring City-States. So as time progresses, following the Mycenaeans and the Dorians, we begin to see from about 750 BC, city-states emerge. And these city-states are composed of acropolis and polises. And it looks a little something like this on a map. As you can see, there's usually a main sort of city center, usually on top of a hill, and then little villages surrounding that. The Greek city-states came in various forms: monarchies, where you have a rule by one leader, in this case a king. Today this is an example of a constitutional monarchy, the United Kingdom. You can have an aristocracy, where you're ruled by nobility, or an oligarchy, where it's ruling by a few. Now here's a list of what it looks like from the textbook, and what's interesting is these formats of how to rule, how to govern still exist in the world today. So monarchies, not very many today, but examples: Lichtenstein in Europe. So the king there has absolute power, so he could veto bills passed by Congress or even passed by the people. You also have nobility, where the families you're born into let you rule, like Saudi Arabia. You have oligarchies like China, where just a chosen small percentage of the population are making decisions for the rest of everyone else. And finally, direct democracy, which is most countries today. In some form or another, countries have democracies where people vote. The reason I chose Brazil and Argentina is because they have especially young voting ages, where you have to be 16 or older to vote in these countries. Now, Athens builds the first sort of earliest form of democracy we've seen. And it's a limited democracy, as is any democracy, but it's especially limited back then because the only people who can vote are people who are born in Athens, people who own property in Athens, and people who are male. So, I mean, we're talking about a small part of society. So this concept of democracy is incredibly interesting because the definition, according to the Webster's Dictionary, says a government by the people. But when we think of it, is there such thing as a nation that's 100% democratic? No, right? If it was totally democratic, it would mean 5-year-olds can vote, 10-year-olds can vote, right? Every country has its limits. For example, in South Korea, people who are in jail cannot vote. Also, those under the age of 19 cannot vote. So it's an interesting concept to think about. Do you agree with these policies? Do you disagree with these policies? Earlier I mentioned Brazil. Argentina's voting age is 16. Japan's voting age is 20. So what is the right voting age? Who should be able to vote? Who should not be able to vote? It's an interesting concept to think about when we talk about democracy. So Athenian education. So Athenian education was limited for just wealthy families. And this made sense because, as I mentioned earlier, people who were part of the government and made big decisions generally were landowners, property owners, and they tend to be from wealthier families. Girls did not get any formal education. They learned from their mothers. Boys received training, especially in public speaking. And this is very important here, that Athenians also found training of the body just as important as the training of the mind. This was not as extensive as the Spartans, which I'll talk about in a second, but it really shows this sort of Greek ethos towards training your body and your mind. Even when we look at Greek philosophers, for example, like Socrates, he once stated, "No man has the right to be an amateur in the matter of physical training. It is a shame for a man to grow old without seeing the beauty and strength of which his body is capable of." So the Greeks really emphasized not just training the mind, but the body itself. So speaking of the Spartans began to dominate from the southern parts of Greece from about the 700 BCs. They started off by taking over the people who were already there, the Mycenaeans, and making them their slaves. The Spartans were truly a unique state because it was a military state. So yes, they had education, but for the most part, it was an oligarchy state run based on military strength and power. So we look at their government, you'll notice there's some unique parts about them, especially different in comparison to other Greek city-states. So first of all, you'll notice how small their Senate is. Their Senate is only 30 people. and they had 2 kings. So you only have about 30-something people making decisions for the entire city-state. And they had what you consider a diarchy. So what that means is 2 leaders. And what's interesting is the Romans later on followed this model of having 2 leaders, which is very unique when you think about the 21st century. We don't have 2 presidents, we don't have 2 kings or queens, we don't have 2 prime ministers, but back then this was the preferred system. Now Sparta was a military state. So every Spartan male was moved into the barracks and were trained strictly from age 7. And this system was known as agoge. So agoge would train young boys from a very young age, from age 7, and they would learn how to fight and they learn how to kill. And in fact, it was so strict and so brutal. Some of these missions included killing helots in order to become a true Spartan warrior. And also through this process, some children did not make it. So in this sense, only the strongest survived in Spartan society. So as I mentioned in the video earlier, Spartan boys were actually given permission to kill helots in order to become a better soldier. Spartan women also received military training, and girls in Spartan society were very different from the other city-states in the sense that they had more power. And now you have this new kind of ultra army emerging in Sparta where they use the system known as the phalanx. The phalanx system looks a little something like this, where everyone is lined together, everyone is protecting the man next to them, they have shields blocking, and then they use these long arrows to stab through once the opponents get close enough. And this is known as the phalanx system. Later on, this system is also used by the Romans, it's also used by Alexander the Great. It's constantly been evolved upon, but the Greeks were the original group to use this system known as the phalanx. So not just a major part of Greek history, but just world history altogether is the Persian Wars. And we're going to look at the Persian Wars in 3 battles. The Battle of Marathon, Battle of Thermopylae, and finally the Battle of Salamis. So the whole war begins as the Persian Empire, as you can see there, is just enormous. That's the Persian Empire in yellow, and the Greece city-states in orange, moves westward to try to take over Greece in order to expand this vast empire they had created. Now, early on, they're successful and they're able to take the city-states of the eastern part of Greece. However, eventually, the Greeks in the east side of what was then called Ionia begin to rebel and fight off the Persians. Perhaps the most notable battle that takes place in this early stage of the Persian Wars is the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks, despite being outnumbered, are able to fend off the Persian army, much larger in size in terms of numbers and weapons, but the Greeks are superior at hand-to-hand combat, and they're able to push away the Persians, fend them off Greek land. And the strategy they use here is actually very similar to what samurai used in the past, where if you have less numbers, you bring your enemies into a more narrow, into a situation where they're forced to fight more one-on-one. That way you can get rid, or at least lower the disadvantage you have of having fewer numbers. So following the war, or the battle, Philippides brings the news to Athens, and this has sort of become a sort of legendary story. So legend goes that it was originally 25 miles from Marathon to Athens, and hundreds of years later, when the Olympics took place, there was the event called the Marathon, and that was originally 25 miles, but then it was changed to 26.2 because when it took place in England, the Queen at the time wanted it to finish in front of the Royal Palace. And ever since then, the Olympic marathon has been 42.195 kilometers, this very exact distance based on when they moved the distance from 25 miles to 26.2 miles when the Olympics were held in England. And that's what it still is run today, and that's what people continue to run in marathons in the morning. Legends also say that Philippides, that's an interesting name, right? Philippides died when he got to Athens to announce Greek victory. So the empire you saw earlier of Persia was this vast empire created by Darius the Great, and for him, this failure to capture this tiny little part known as eastern part of Greece was a major bane of his legacy. And when he died, he left his leadership to Xerxes, and Xerxes was determined to take that territory that Darius the Great failed to take. So 10 years later, there's the Battle of Thermopylae. Many people may know this battle from that famous Hollywood movie 300, which has a lot of historical inaccuracies, but nonetheless has some accurate parts to it, which are interesting and worth watching. So then what's very interesting about Greece is, as I mentioned before, it's city-states, right? There's no Greece as a country. So when the Persians came attacking, the Greeks weren't really unified. Some Greek city-states were saying, oh, it's okay, just let them take the east. Other Greek city-states are saying, no, we have to unite together as Greeks and stop them. And there was really no unification. And before they knew it, the Persians were at the gates attacking. So the Greek city-states, not really united. One of the only city-states to stand up against the Persians were the Spartans. So the Spartans decided to use the same strategy they used at Marathon, to bring the Persians into a narrow area where they could fight. However, this time the numbers of the Persians were far too great. The mere 20,000 Spartans could not stop the 400,000 Persians. And the Greeks were able to hold up, or the Spartans, combined with a few other city-states, were able to valiantly fight off the Persians for 3 full days, but eventually they were all killed in battle, and their sacrifice would end up actually uniting the Greek city-states, because until then, Greek city-states didn't really feel like there was a reason to fight together, but they saw how the Spartans stood up against the Persians, and that was one of the reasons why the city-states got together following this battle of Thermopylae. Another interesting point to add here is Herodotus, also known as the father of history, also known as father of lies, wrote that there were 2 million Persians who fought 300 Spartans. And that's where the number 300 actually comes from for that Hollywood film. Following their victory at Thermopylae, Persia was looking like they would advance on to conquer Greece, but this was not the case. Aforementioned, the battles in Thermopylae helped unite the city-states, and the Greeks fought back. And it all culminates at Battle of Salamis, where the Persians, who were overly ambitious, went straight towards the Greeks, and they were sort of lured into the narrow strait. So they're lured into, again, a narrow area. And as I mentioned earlier, when you fight in a narrow area, your number advantage no longer counts. This strategy proves to be great for the Greeks, and the Greeks are able to fend off the Persians, and Persia fails to conquer the city-states of Greece. So a few important characters you should know revolving around the Persian Wars. Xerxes, who takes power after Darius. This is probably one of the points where 300 sort of gets it wrong. Xerxes has a thick beard, right? It doesn't really look like this, but nonetheless, it's an interesting sort of way perhaps Herodotus illustrated Xerxes to look like. You have Themistocles, the prominent Athenian tactician and politician. He was able to come up with the idea to fight in the narrow waters, and he was one of the reasons why the Greeks were victorious at the Battle of Salamis. Last but not least, Artemisia, who commanded naval ships for the Persians in the Battle of Salamis. And the fact that she was a woman enraged the Greeks, because they felt like that fighting a war was a man's job, and they in fact disliked her so much they offered a reward of money for anyone who could capture this commander of this Persian ship. So the legacy of the Persian Wars is now there's sort of a self-confidence in Greeks that they can hold their own once they've fended off this grand Persian Empire. Even more important, you see a league emerge. You begin to see what was once these city-states, all separate with different types of governments and politics, are now becoming one, with Athens being in charge. However, at the same time, this is a beginning of a new issue. Who is going to be in charge of these set city-states? And Athens emerges as a leader at the beginning, but there's one group that's not a big fan of this, the Spartans. The two groups were almost the complete opposite. Right? The Athenians were the ones who were about philosophy and democracy, while the Spartans ruled with oligarchy, and they were about power and warfare. And this eventually leads towards two leagues emerging, the Peloponnesian League and the Delian League, and these two eventually go into battle, and we'll talk more about that in a future section. Here's a copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Have an excellent day. Goodbye.